Are you ready? A Rutgers professor is actually claiming that time is racist. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV. And as I mentioned, yes, a Rutgers Associate Professor of Women's Gender Studies and African Studies named Brittany Cooper just hit it big via tax-funded national public radio and a TED Talk discussing, yeah, you got it, her thesis that time is racist.
What if I told you that time has a race?
Now, she is serious and she's earnest, and her theory goes, well, deeper than the insulting introduction might indicate. But let's start with the introduction, which begins with what she calls CP time.
In the African American communities from which I come, we have a long-standing, multi-generational joke about what we call CP time, or colored people's time. Now, we no longer refer to African Americans as colored, but this long-standing joke about our perpetual lateness to church, to cookouts, to family events, and even to our own funerals remains. I personally am a stickler for time. It's almost as if my mother, when I was growing up, said, "We will not be those black people."
So, according to Cooper, African Americans know themselves to be so prone to lateness that they have their own sense of time. It is, of course, a sense that somehow runs contrary to the white-dominated, capitalist-centered America of today, or ever. And, of course, if this were true, it would be pretty darn silly, because we all know that concepts of time and time schedules are as old as man. They run through every culture, from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt to the non-whites who created America's Stonehenge in New Hampshire to mark the solar cycle. Likewise, the standardization of time zones was, as noted in the great book I Must Speak Out, developed to make sure that east-west train travelers could make their connections. It was a response to consumer demand. But Professor Cooper's thesis is larger than the idea that African Americans' conception of time puts them at a disadvantage in a white constructed world that smiles on punctuality. In fact, her point is that African Americans have never been considered part of history and are being erased today through a lack of political attention to inner city needs. To let her say it,
white people own time.
Now, that's its own form of, well, I guess you could say racial categorization, but let's look deeper at her argument. Cooper says racism appears in how we narrate history and shove the present into the past.
The U.S. was never pre-race. So to claim that we're post-race when we have yet to grapple with the impact of race on black people, Latinos, or the indigenous is disingenuous. We treat time as though it is timeless, as though it has always been this way, as though it doesn't have a political history bound up with the plunder of indigenous lands, the genocide of indigenous people, and the stealing of Africans from their homeland. When white male European philosophers first thought to conceptualize time and history, one famously declared, "Africa is no historical part of the world." He was essentially saying that Africans were people outside of history who had had no impact on time or the march of progress. This idea that black people have had no impact on history is one of the foundational ideas of white supremacy.
And of course, there have been politicians and historians in American history who have not told the full truth of some of those issues. But today, the very fact that Cooper is a professor of African studies at one of the most expensive universities in the United States is just one indication that seems to belie her claim. The fact that African studies departments exist in virtually every major U.S. college is another indication that perhaps Contemporary Americans are well aware of the history that included slavery. And if we're talking narratives here, then why is it that Professor Cooper, who controlled the narrative in this TED-filled hall, did not note the dark history of Black Africans capturing and selling other Black Africans into the slave trade? Why doesn't she note the multiple Native American Indian tribes that enslaved Africans? What about the Irish, who were enslaved by the British? The multiple indigenous peoples who were enslaved by the Romans or the Egyptians? How far back do you want to go? And as far as the present goes, Professor Cooper also blames white dominance over history and time for excluding terrible wrongs from today's narrative. Well, how about the workday and minimum wage?
Well, I've already told you that white people own time. Those in power dictate the pace of the workday. They dictate how much money our time is actually worth. And Professor George Lipsitz argues that white people even dictate the pace of social inclusion. They dictate how long it will actually take for minority groups to receive the rights that they have been fighting for.
Well, considering the fact that the consumer is at the deciding end of every transaction and the only thing standing between the consumer and business people and employees is the government, which has been dominated for decades by politicians who've imposed just those minimum wage laws and licensing laws that have been used to hobble low-skilled minorities and immigrants, pushing them into the black market where they confront a justice system that they don't think is fair to them. Perhaps some time spent with economic professors like Walter Williams could offer Professor Cooper some knowledge of the racist history of minimum wage laws. Finally, she blames white dominant America for pushing black people out of the traditionally black neighborhoods like Atlanta and DC to make room for gentrification, never mentioning that both of those cities have been run for years by African American politicians.
But another place that we see these time-space clashes is in gentrifying cities like Atlanta, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C. Places that have had black populations for generations. But now, in the name of urban renewal and progress, these communities are pushed out in service of bringing them into the 21st century.
Does she mention the fact that black-on-black homicides are the most dominant form in D.C., or that same-race homicides dominate in every racial group in the United States? No, she does not. So in a speech about controlled narratives, one comes away wondering about a controlled narrative that one was offered by a professor at a huge university, broadcast by TED, and fawningly covered by tax-funded National Public Radio. But to say that the narrative of 21st century America is controlled by white America, even as she gets all this attention and excludes all that information, I don't think it's a very sound argument. Thought I would bring it up. I hope I've handled it well. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, like and subscribe and tell your friends about us. For MRC-TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.